It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Plant Sciences building. Those of you who have been in my events before know that I will start on time and we will do our very best to end on time. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Lommel, the Associate Dean for Research for the College of Ag and Life Sciences, to start things off.
Thank you, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Plant Sciences building at NC State University at our Centennial campus. The topic of today's discussion is perfect for what we're trying to do in the Plant Sciences Initiative, and I think that'll become apparent as we go through the afternoon. Welcome to the Long-Term Carbon Sequestration Emerging Issues Showcase. As Deborah said, I'm Steve Lommel. I'm the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Ag and Life Sciences. However, this is a broader than our college activity, and I just wanted everybody to understand that. The research, emerging research showcases were developed as a way to introduce our external stakeholders to new research projects that could benefit from external collaborations and eventually investments and possibly startups. It's part of our culture, ethos, and motto at NC State University, think and do. We have a lot of folks who are doing great research, and collaborating with our stakeholders, you folks, allows us to do the do part. Today we will focus on the important role of academic innovation plays in advancing sustainability, specifically carbon capture and long-term sequestration of carbon. This is one of the grand challenges, and it cuts across many departments, many colleges, and even many universities. Because of that, I'm very excited because I've been living and breathing and thinking interdisciplinarity for the last 15 years or so, and really this is what this is all about and what we're going to hear about today. So I think on that note, I'll go ahead and go to the next speaker and allow who we have up next, Adrian, who's going to speak about the Plant Sciences building and maybe a little more in detail of what's going on. One final note, we in our college, we are a College of Ag and Life Sciences. Agriculture is a great way to capture fixed carbon and get it into the soil. So certainly that's something that we'll be concentrating on in our building, in our college, but that's not really the only way that you'll be hearing about it today. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks, Steve. So, hi everybody. It's great to see so many colleagues, friends from the university, from the RTP region, from the park, from I think even beyond. So thank you all for coming out. Welcome to the Plant Sciences building. I'm the third person to tell you that, but as you can tell, we're very proud of this building that was only opened 10 months ago. So we're very, very new. It still has that kind of new car smell, and we're still opening up parts of the building to be operational. But you're all very welcome, and I hope while you're here today, for those of you who don't know the building, you'll take the opportunity to have a little look around and get to see some of the things that we're doing here. Indeed, not just in this building, but also get a feel for some of the research that's going on in campus and even out to our research farms, which we're very, very connected with. The Plant Sciences Initiative mission is to solve grand challenges in agriculture and the environment through interdisciplinary, team-based science, partnerships, and talent development. And the success of the Plant Sciences Initiative will be determined both by its output and its impact. And that will take many forms. It will take the forms of new discoveries, but also through the creation of new intellectual property, spin-outs, and interventions that can be implemented outside the academic world. It's my hope that eventually an NC State University technology, maybe one of the ones that we're going to hear about a little bit later today, will graduate from the lab, perhaps to our incubator space that we're constructing right now on the 4th floor, and then eventually out off campus to be successful somewhere. That would be absolutely amazing. Sustainability is a global challenge, and NC State Research is building innovative tools for carbon removal from the environment. Public-private partnership is key to taking those innovations out of the university and into the on-farm or commercial application. And as a university, we're also building a workforce that is ready to take on these sustainability challenges and help provide solutions. Sustainability and carbon sequestration require us to bring together all the bright minds to work together. That means you guys. And NC State is a leader in building interdisciplinary research teams and acting as a convening organism, as evidenced by the Plant Sciences Initiative, but also by the event today. So with that, again, welcome. I'm going to hand over to Mark Schmidt.
All right, well, thank you. Before I begin with just a couple comments, I want to offer that, early on when this event was being planned, part of the discussion was to be more inclusive just beyond CALS and to include all the colleges here. And certainly, we're very appreciative for the partnerships office that I represent to have that broad purview of the university. So I want to thank Adrian, but also Deborah and Steve as well for that opportunity. So I've attended a few of these events before, both as an industry partner, but also now as part of the university. And I can tell you, if you haven't been to one before, I think they're a great opportunity to, and a great format to talk about a lot of relevant topics, but also how we can engage on those topics. And I think the attendance that we have today really reinforces that. So again, my name is Mark Schmidt. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor of Partnerships, and part of my role here really is to build connections across industry, government, and nonprofit entities with the university. That takes on many different forms. We work very closely with CALS, but also across all of the different colleges as well, and I think it's a great privilege, as I mentioned, that for many of those colleges to be represented here today. Among the 120 different partners that we have in our existing portfolio, as well as many new partners coming to the university, there's really two common areas of need. One of those is on access to talent, student and faculty talent. The other one is on sustainability. That's pretty much without exception across the board in terms of opportunity for the university, and certainly under the premise of wanting help with sustainability, carbon is very much in focus with that. Prior to my joining NC State, I was at John Deere for 22 years, and I can say that NC State played a very meaningful role in my role at John Deere in terms of how we developed our carbon plan and our sustainability strategy at the time. So in many ways, I think this event is a really strong expression of two things, those two common needs, in both in profiling faculty research and talent, but also the outstanding work that happens when talent and research come together. And both of those are going to be needed really to address a lot of the global challenges that we have in front of us, including sustainability. So I think all of us would agree that partnering is a good thing, and the engagement that we can get from an event like this will provide a lot of added value, but also provide an opportunity for the resources that will be required to continue the work at hand. So as you think about the event today and as you learn different things, certainly if you have an interest in talking more, I'll be happy to connect with any of you to understand how you might engage with the university, but I also will call on Nikki and Keisha from our office here. In addition to Deborah and her team, we'll be happy to connect with any of you to talk about engagement with the university. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and as part of continuing the program, I will transition to Dr. Joe Sagues, who is the Assistant Professor in Biological and Agricultural Engineering, and Joe has had two different roles leading up to today. One was really serving as the subject matter expert to plan the event and the speakers, but also he's going to be your Master of Ceremonies today, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that nice introduction, Mark. Let's talk about carbon. I want to start off with this question: why long-term carbon sequestration? And I think we can answer this with a metaphor. So let's assume in this metaphor, our atmosphere is the bathtub and the faucet is our carbon emissions, right? And so we are filling up our atmospheric bathtub with 55 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, right? I'm using carbon dioxide equivalent because it's not just carbon dioxide. We also have other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide that we have to deal with. Okay, and so in our bathtub, we have about 3.3 trillion tons of CO2 floating around. That's way too much, right? So we need to stop filling up the bathtub so much. We have a problem. And so what can we do? We can stop the flow of water in this metaphor, right? That's an obvious solution, and that's what we're doing with solar energy, with nuclear energy, with wind energy, et cetera, electric vehicles, and those are all fantastic technologies, and they need to move as quickly as possible. But a lot of experts now believe that's not going to be enough. There's still going to be some types of fossil carbon emissions from heavy industry, from certain parts of agriculture that will continue emitting, and it's going to be hard to decarbonize those sources of emissions at the rate that we need to decarbonize to hit our climate targets. Also, we have methane and nitrous oxide, right? Two really nasty greenhouse gases that are hard to tackle. And so we can open the plug, right? We can start draining our bathtub. And that is what carbon removal or carbon sequestration is really all about. And so if the experts believe the rate at which we need to start draining our bathtub is about 5 to 10, maybe 20 billion tons of CO2 per year, which if you look, that's a small fraction of our total emissions. And so what I'm getting at here is carbon removal is not a silver bullet. It's not the total solution. It's just a small piece of a big pie of climate mitigation solutions. And so let's look at some of the carbon removal pathways that are under development, right? On the top, we can start with forest management. And with this definition of forest management, I'm including afforestation, I'm including reforestation, right? Planting trees, but also managing forests in a way that help to sequester more carbon. So that's one pathway. Another pathway is soil carbon sequestration. And this definition, I'm really talking about agricultural applications, different practices that can be applied in agriculture to bring carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil. So no-till agriculture, cover cropping, certain types of inoculants, right? You're gonna hear more about this soon. I'm just giving you a quick highlight right now. And so that's another pathway, very exciting, especially in the Plant Science Initiative. Bioprocessing and bioproducts, this is what I focus on, right? This is developing conversion technologies to take biomass and sequester carbon. And there's a couple of different ways this can be done. The bioproducts themselves, like making a bioplastic or making a biochar, that locks away carbon from the atmosphere. You can capture the CO2 from fermentation, for instance, and that can be sequestered deep underground. The next is direct air capture, right? So the prior three pathways are all biotic. They involve biology to a certain degree. Direct air capture is mostly abiotic. It uses inorganic chemistry to directly remove CO2 from the air. Mineralization, this is a pretty fascinating, sort of a newer emerging pathway, taking rocks, crushing them up, spreading them out, and letting these particular rocks with particular chemistries pull CO2 out of the air. And lastly, we have a very broad classification of these technologies, which is oceanic carbon removal, and this is using coastal and ocean systems to remove carbon. So these pathways are all great. There's a lot of funding going into developing these, lots of startup companies, lots of big corporations putting money into this space. But we feel like, my colleagues and I and a lot of other folks feel like there's a gap around the carbon storage mediums, right? How are we ensuring this carbon stays out of the atmosphere for a long time? Long time meaning 100-year minimum, like hopefully longer, like 1,000 plus, 10,000 years is what we're aiming for ideally here. And so if you look through these different storage mediums you have for forest management and soil carbon sequestration, you have above ground biomass in the soil, right? And these technologies are advancing rapidly, but there is some uncertainty around how that carbon is stored, especially in the soil, right? And so we can solve this problem. It needs to be done through monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, right? And so there needs to be more engagement around monitoring the carbon in these particular carbon storage mediums. Bioproducts also have uncertainty, right? When a bioplastic goes into a landfill, how much of that carbon is sequestered? How much gets converted to methane? How much gets converted to CO2? Questions, right? Biochar also, lots of questions around the durability of that carbon. Geological formations, interestingly, are relatively low risk. They're high cost, but taking CO2, compressing it into a liquid and pumping it a mile underground can be done pretty reliably. It's just expensive. And that form of storage is 10,000 year plus, right? Then you have above ground minerals. This is the bicarbonates and the carbonate ions from mineralization. Where do they end up? Do they go into the ocean? Do they get entrapped in the soil? Right? Questions around that type of storage. And then the marine biomass, whether that be macroalgae or microalgae, how does that get stored in the ocean? And then the sediment layers, right? Lots of research questions, lots of opportunity to improve carbon removal, the industry as a whole. I want to show a couple recent publications in the media. The first one is from Forbes, right, titled "The Carbon Credit Market Confuses the Corporate World." Right? Another one released, and both of these are from last month. Another one from The Guardian, right? More than 90% of rainforest carbon offsets by biggest certifier are worthless, analysis shows. These are just two publications, right? There's uncertainty in these as well. But there is a recurring theme right now in the media and also in the scientific literature around how much can we really trust these carbon offsets. And so I do think there's some optimism because my colleagues and I see a bit of a shift away from carbon offsets to carbon removals. There is still absolutely a place for carbon offsets, and they're going to continue being a big deal. There's a lot of good carbon offsets out there. But carbon removals are different. They're both carbon credits, but a carbon removal credit means you physically must remove 1 ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere permanently. That is a standard for a carbon removal credit. And so the level of monitoring, verification, and reporting, or MRV, for carbon removals is much more rigorous. And you're going to hear about this from Dan Sanchez here shortly, right? So I think we might be in a transition from sort of this uncertain permanence or durability to a more certain durability of the carbon, but that it will come at a higher cost. But overall, long term, I think for the carbon removal industry, that's a good thing. Reputation will improve, the trust will improve. And so building on this optimism, the corporate world, right, we're here to really talk about academia and industry engagement. The corporate world they're buying into this idea of carbon removals. And so Stripe, Alphabet, Shopify, Meta, McKinsey, they've developed this Frontier Fund, which is about $1 billion, to help scale up promising carbon removal technologies. Also, Microsoft is actually purchasing carbon removals today, right? And they are very rigorous with the companies that they buy these carbon removal credits from. They want to be sure that carbon is not volatilized back in the atmosphere through some type of forest fire or et cetera. All right, and so what are other corporations doing? Well, lucky for you all, you're going to hear shortly from Arlene Cotie from Bayer, who's going to be talking about the role that she's playing in agriculture, as particularly, right? Next, you're going to hear from Dan Sanchez from Carbon Direct after Arlene, who's going to talk about the very interesting role he's playing at Carbon Direct to facilitate the sale and purchase of high-quality carbon removal credits. And then after you hear from Dan and Arlene, we're going to have 5 amazing faculty come up from NC State and talk about the research that they're doing. So we'll have Justin Baker come up and talk about what he's doing with forest management. Alex Woodley will come up and talk about soil carbon sequestration. Minliang Yang will talk about the work she's doing with bioprocessing and bioproducts and the different TEA, LCA tools that she's developing. I'm speaking now. I'm not coming back up, but just a quick plug, my own program. I develop bioprocesses, carbon-negative bioprocesses, fermentation, anaerobic digestion, composting, things like that. And you'll hear from one of my PhD students at the very end. Sonja Salmon will come up and talk about these really interesting materials she's developing for carbon capture, including direct air capture. And then last, we'll have Chris Osburn come up and talk about the coastal and oceanic carbon cycling assessments that he's doing and the implications for carbon removal. I want to thank you all again for coming. This is really exciting. Don't forget, we have a networking session from 5 to 6 after this, and there will be time for Q&A, so hold your questions. The time is coming. Thank you. Arlene Cotie is next. Sorry about that.
Sure. Excellent, thank you. I didn't even have to touch anything. Do I need to advance the slides?
There's a clicker right on the podium.
Got it, thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, thank you, because I do need an interactive audience. My name's Arlene Cotie, and I work with Bayer Crop Science. I am responsible for all of our carbon assets globally with Bayer, and I'm responsible to manage these carbon assets and ensure that they're cost-effective, scalable, and retain the integrity so that we can mitigate some of these critics that we heard Joe talk about. What I'm going to talk to you about today and how I do that job is we're going to talk about Bayer's foreground project. We're also going to talk about the carbon program that we have that's focused on removals, because Joe said talk about removals, Arlene. Then I'm going to flip. And man, who was it? I think it was Adrian that said that the Plant Science Institute was here to solve grand challenges. Do we have grand challenges in this space, guys, in soil sequestration? Scaling voluntary carbon markets through cost-effective MRVs. That's where I'm going to spend most of my time, because that's where we need help. And then I'll finish with one voice. All right, just a little bit about Bayer's program. Bayer started this year, well, actually September last year, we launched our foreground program. And one of the reasons for launching the foreground program, as most of you know, when you enter into the voluntary carbon market, it's really just rewarding new adopters that are starting new practices. But we've got growers out there that have been doing the right practices for years. And we said, this isn't fair, this isn't right, we want to engage all of them. And for that, that is why the first thing you'll hear us talking about is foreground. And there's a pun intended. It's all about ground. It's all about our soil health. It's about engaging all farmers and meeting all farmers where they're at. It's based on 3 pillars. And the first one is the one that jumps me out of bed in the morning. It's the reason last week I just celebrated 30 years with Bayer. It's the investment we have in R&D. It's the opportunity to work with academics like you that solve problems on my farm. It's the reason I haven't gone back full-time farming, because it's so cool that every time we got a problem, we have this group, this community that can solve these issues. So what does Bayer want to do? We want to bring this out to the front to all farmers, not just those that are moonlighting and working with Bayer and farming on the side, but bring in best-in-class agronomic support, evidence-based field trials and studies. And that's where the first half of my career was really in R&D, and that still is my first love. Next, then, and this way we can engage everybody, no matter where they're at on their regen practices, is our second pillar that we are then, is everybody. Everybody should be able to share in the cost savings. So even if you are a no-tiller for more than a decade, we have programs now. If you're upgrading your no-till equipment or you're a strip tiller, we have programs here where you can go in and get rebates. We have programs for different services and different tools. And foremost, when you enter into this space, one of the biggest things to understand what's happening in your soil is actually the collection of data. And so with that, we're actually giving away FieldView. That's Bayer's platform to collect agronomic data on the field and help us give seed prescriptions to the farmers, but also understand carbon modeling and carbon sequestration. It's through our digital platform called FieldView. That we give away to free to everyone, early adopters and new adopters. And then lastly, all right, if you're eligible and able as a new adopter to take part in the voluntary carbon market, and what I'll be talking about soon, then we've got a Bayer carbon program. In this program, we're really focused on creating offsets. In addition to creating offsets, and why we call my job and why I'm responsible for carbon assets, is that there's more than offsets out there. There's insets, there's value chain interventions, there's footprinting, there's analytics just to understand what's going on the carbon, not only with removals, but with reductions. So as you see, we have another partnership here, and this is where our food partner and our food chain partners are getting really engaged, with the Science-Based Targets team coming down and saying last year that in order for corporates to meet net zero, that they want corporates to reduce their Scope 3 emissions by 90% by 2050 to meet net zero. That means going and buying these cheap offsets in some other industry to offset what you're emitting isn't going to work out for the long. They're forcing corporates to come in and reduce their own emissions first. And that's really where there's a huge opportunity, guys, in the ag, is these food companies, they don't have visibility to the farm. That isn't their core competency in what they're sourcing corn and soybean to understand what's going on in the farm and the opportunities there. So that's where this group comes in. With that then, I am going to talk just a little bit about that Bayer carbon program that I spoke about. Joe asked me to talk about removals. Our Bayer carbon program is focused solely on soil sequestration, removals. What you'll see here real quick, and I'm not going to go into too many details here, but what you'll see here real quick is that we're paying for just 3 new practice adoptions: no-till, strip-till, cover crop, and or a combination of. What you'll also see that's uniquely different from some of our competitors in this space is that we're actually paying for the practice, not the performance. And you think, well, that's crazy. A voluntary carbon market's pretty darn risky, pretty volatile. What's Bayer doing? And it really was, I'm going to come back to my favorite part of the company, the R&D organization. In 2015, we stepped out and we actually joined a pilot with the gold standard and sustained cert organization, along with USDA grant money. You're going to recognize all these names: Corn Growers, Soya Growers, Soil Health Partnership. New modeling entrepreneurs were with us at the time, and I'm sure I'm missing some, but it was in 2015 the foresight of this group that wanted to pilot to understand what are the opportunities in ag. So for more than 4 years, we were digging holes in all the I-states, working with all these brilliant scientists and looking at what the opportunities were for sequestration with our modelers and with our soil scientists. And with that, we had a high level of confidence that when we met with our carbon growers and they said, guys, this is too risky. We don't want to wait 2 years till you collect the data, till you dig the holes, till you go through the verification. It's too risky for us. And we stepped in and said, okay, we have a high level of confidence in our science. We're willing to take on that risk. So you know what? We're going to flip this upside down. We're not going to pay on performance. We're going to pay on practice. So 6, 6, and 9, and in some regions $5 for no-till. That's really what this is about. So how are we different? We're focused on removals. Of course, this is a biological system. With removals will come reductions. We calculate both. And we've taken on the risk. So that's just a little bit. Now, to the grand challenges. I like that one. Sorry for the wordy slide. I wish I could give you pretty diagrams instead, but I'm going to get you working here. First off, I'm going to ask everybody to put their hands up. I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to ask you to hold your hand up until I ask a question that you don't know. So the first one here that I'm going to ask is, how many of you are in the ag industry? My God, I hope everybody's hands are going up. Higher, higher. Okay, well, this is great that there's some people not in the ag industry. I'd like to meet you, see what your interest is in this. All right, with your hands up, how many of you would be confident to come up here and talk about the voluntary carbon market and how it works? Man, oh man. Whoa, no, I still got some hands, that's great. How many of you could come up here and tell me the difference between an offset and an inset? Okay, well, the good news is, those hands that are up, please come and talk to me, because I need all the voices we can get in this space, both within Bayer and within the ag field. There is such a small talent pool here, guys, in this space. So if there's any students in the group, I mean, dig in, lean into this topic. We need help. We need help. And to those that all put their hands down, which was most of the room, don't worry, if I can learn this in 2 years and be responsible for Bayer globally, so can you. I know it. I just need you to lean in and work with me. So with that then, what is MRV? Gosh, you know, about 5 minutes after you start talking about soil sequestration, we all can wrap our hands around that, being in the ag industry, working with soils and crops, we can all wrap our hands around that and what crops are doing and how we're sequestering carbon. But as soon as we start talking about the voluntary carbon market, we start losing people, as we did hands here in the room. And then we start losing even more people when they start saying MRV, because I can promise you that is like the second buzzword after voluntary carbon markets. Let's talk about MRV, but little to nobody can actually tell you what MRV is. So I wanted to take the opportunity to say, this is where I need help. This is where some of our biggest grand challenges are in this particular space for us to commercialize this. First one, M. M is actually not measure. It's not measure, it's monitor. And what does that mean in the voluntary carbon market? That means collect data. Oh my God, collect data. Bayer took the position to be model agnostic, and what that meant when we went model agnostic is that we had to ask of a grower, on average, about 80 different data points for 1 year for us to put into any model we wanted to actually model. Imagine that conversation. If that wasn't hard enough, even with the FieldView platform that we have where they can collect data, we didn't actually build FieldView for carbon data. So it won't be till this spring that when we give away FieldView for free, there'll actually be carbon questions, carbon data that can be collected. So up until now, we've had a combination of manual and automated. And if 1 year's data wasn't enough, most of the registries actually ask you to baseline historically 3 years prior to new practice adoption. So now times that by 3, what you're asking a grower. And we actually do have one marketplace out there today that uses a 10-year dynamic baseline. 10 years of data, over 500,000 acres, we have been collecting. So data heavy, guys. And, you know, ideally, where do we got to go with this? Full equipment automation. You know, what most farmers have, and the first thing for adopting was really the autonomous steering, followed by harvest yields and understanding what's coming out the combine and what yields they have. But what do we need when we're trying to measure no-till and cover crops? No-till tillage equipment, that is more automation, but honestly, the biggest thing we have is tillage equipment. What type of sensors or automated data are we collecting for tillage? I could go on, and I won't. I promise I'll go quicker here. Tillage, vertical tillage, guys. Vertical tillage can be anything when you're talking to a farmer, to a mulching event where he's got no down pressure and discs are straight up, to just a slip of the hand and a hydraulic lever to pushing 2 to 3 inches in the ground, and by God, angle those discs and you're turning the soil completely over. What's happening? Reversal. So when you go out and ask a farmer if he did any tillage event and he says, yeah, I did vertical tillage, what do you put into the model? What do you put into the model? What was he really doing with that vertical tillage? So full automation. Now, full equipment automation, and you guys know where the landscape is in agriculture and the equipment that's out there, and the mix of new and what can be automated and what's next. So the ag engineers are rubbing their hands and going, I'm getting money from Bayer. They want us to automate the equipment. I think we might have even missed the boat on that one. I think we might even need to think more futuristic. Can we actually measure the carbon just with satellites and models? I'll leave that out there and move on. Field boundaries, I got same issues there. We're working with the biologic. Farmer comes in, he draws his field boundaries. I don't know how many of you have ever done production or had to follow through contracts on acres with farmers, but by the end of harvest, depending on drought, depending on flooding events, that field boundary can look completely different. If he had a flooding event and he comes back and he's going to seed his sloughs, I'm from Saskatchewan, that's where my farm is, and when we do have a wet year, we get to come back and seed our sloughs. Now I've got 2 planting events. As a project developer for Bayer, I can only sequester carbon where I've actually planted the crop, where there's no crop. And so imagine tracking those field boundaries through the whole growing season and how many times they change when you're working with models and you're having to come down to the performance of each acre. So lots, when I think of spatial engineers, we need lots of help here too in a biologic and monitoring it over long terms of space. Permanence, oh, I love this one. Joe had permanence on his slide. Anybody look up the the Climate Action Reserve Protocol, the SEP protocol they call it, the Soil Enrichment Protocol. It's where we have the opportunity to create an offset for our growers here in the US. What they say, once the project is done, on average 10 to 20 years, and your project is done and you're done your contract, they're growing, you're not looking to create any more offsets. Me, as a project developer, need to monitor that field for another 100 years. Because when they sell an offset and a removal, they say that that's removed out of the air for 100 years. Quick, got it. Love that one. I had to just get you guys to think about that. 100-year monitoring's on us, our costs, our risks for Bayer. There are many challenges here that I have that I'm hoping the panelists here this afternoon are going to talk about. And if there's anything else that I can move quickly through here, soil sampling. Right now, there's not a high level of confidence in our models, so the quickest path that we've got is a combination of using models and soil sampling. But soil samples are costly. What I can tell you, a year ago when I started this and I looked to get 1 million acres stratified and soil sampled, there wasn't enough labs in the US to do that for me. And it's taken me 3 seasons, 12 months, to even get the samplers out there to do that. High cost. With that, guys, I'm going to leave you with one last side and one last ask, and it's really about one voice. We saw the critic side that Joe gave us. They seen it. You know what? Working for Bayer for 30 years, I just assume they're going to attack me. But they're attacking our whole industry here. Guys, there is a great opportunity for us to shape this voluntary carbon market with the minds that are in this room. And I just ask that you all lean into the discussion and don't be afraid about what you do know. Respond with what you do know. What you do know is where there's a will, there's a way, and science will lead us there and find the answer. Thank you.
Perfect, great. It's a pleasure to speak with you. My name is Dan Sanchez. I'm a faculty member at UC Berkeley, currently on entrepreneurial leave, working with a company called Carbon Direct. And what Carbon Direct is working to do is really scale markets for high quality carbon removal. So exactly what we're trying to discuss today. What I was hoping to do was really take you through, pick up where Joe left off, really describing not only the different approaches to carbon dioxide removal, but the differentiators of quality between those approaches and some of the evidence that we have right now around how well the existing protocols, the existing market, and the market that we might have in the future is working to achieve that high quality opportunity. So, as Joe mentioned, there are really two ways to pull CO2 out of the air. One is to use biology. When plants grow, they fix CO2 from the atmosphere, store carbon above ground biomass, below ground biomass, soils, things like that. Or we can use engineered approaches to pull carbon out of the air. This is using, it looks closer to chemistry than biology, but this is using things like mining or manufacturing or energy production, these complicated engineered systems to remove CO2 from the air. And we already heard about a number of these different approaches already. We can manage or restore terrestrial land. We can manage or restore aquatic ecosystems. We can store carbon in soils and do soil carbon sequestration. Kind of moving further to the right, we have these opportunities with biomass and bioenergy and bioproducts, things like capturing biogenic carbon and storing it underground in deep geologic formations, or making biochar, which is a recalcitrant form of carbon that holds CO2 out of the atmosphere, all the way over to things like direct air capture or enhanced mineral weathering, where we're, really using engineered systems and chemistry to pull CO2 out of the air. But how do we monetize these things? How do we value these things? How do we trade these things right now? Right now, we're using a mechanism known as carbon offsets. I think that's a little pejorative. We could also just say carbon credits if it feels a little better to you. But let me spend a second taking you through kind of what's going on with carbon offsets right now. Apologies for all the text. But carbon offsets can represent a lot of different things. They can be for avoiding emissions, they can be for reducing emissions, or they can be for removing CO2 emissions. What's common across all of them is that they're bought, sold, or traded, typically in a voluntary carbon market. Most of these markets right now are voluntary, meaning that people are not complied by law to participate with them. Rather, they're doing it for their own goals, their own social goals, their own corporate social responsibility opportunities. The fundamental metric we're talking about is 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. As Joe said before, it's not just CO2, it's CO2 and other important greenhouse gases. But 1 offset or 1 credit represents 1 metric ton of CO2 avoided, reduced, or removed from the atmosphere. We transacted 240 million credits on the voluntary carbon market in 2022. It's been growing pretty substantially over the past 5 years. Again, we've had a lot of large corporates in particular really entering the voluntary carbon market and trying to scale that up. Again, mostly this is used by companies to make corporate claims about their net emissions or their carbon neutrality. People are also interested in this for other reasons, of course, though. It's not just carbon. It's the co-benefits that come, whether in communities or in ecosystems, along with these kinds of restoration projects. Most offsets, historically, and including today, are for either avoided or reduced emissions, not for carbon removal. At Carbon Direct, we like to say that high-quality carbon removal is about 3% of the total market. That means that 97% doesn't meet our quality criteria, which I'll get into in a second. Nature-based projects really do dominate the offsets that are classified as removals. These are things like forest management or soil carbon sequestration, really storing things in these temporary carbon stores. And then finally, not all offsets are created equal in terms of quality. I'll get to that in just a second, how we define quality at Carbon Direct. But what I really hope to do today is kind of introduce those quality principles and then very quickly run through the different verticals, get you up to speed around what people are saying about what's high quality and what's not high quality. These are all the offsets tracked by a nice database at UC Berkeley that have ever been issued on the voluntary carbon market. You notice the largest group is forestry and land use. What that primarily is actually for avoided deforestation. I don't know if anyone followed RED back in the day. It's still happening. We have these markets to prevent the destruction of tropical forests. Those carbon benefits of avoiding deforestation are then quantified and sold on the voluntary carbon market. The second largest offset that's ever been issued is for renewable energy. You might scratch your head, it's like, how does renewable energy remove carbon from the atmosphere? And again, it's for avoidance or reduction that we're generating these emissions. It's solar or wind power displacing coal or natural gas. That's been a large source of offsets. It's becoming a lot smaller because I think people are understanding that it's not necessarily high quality. The remainder of credits issued by scope, really, they vary. Again, they're mostly in avoidance or in reductions rather than in removal, but they span industries. They span refrigerant destruction, soil carbon storage, anaerobic digesters, really take your pick. What we do at Carbon Direct and is we work with a lot of buyers of carbon removal to advise them around what we see as quality. Microsoft is one of our clients. We issue this report every year, Principles of High Quality Carbon Removal, along with Microsoft, where we're really trying to guide project developers that want to bring their supply to Microsoft to essentially these high quality principles. The first and likely most important one is one of additionality. What we need to make sure is that when someone purchases a carbon offset or a carbon credit, that leads to additional carbon being removed from the atmosphere. What that means is that the person could not have been doing it already just for their own sake or through their own practices. If they're already making money, then there's really no change in practice that is brought about by the purchase of a carbon credit. This additionality is a really important issue, particularly within forestry. We'll get into that a little bit more later. Closely related to that is a baseline, and the baseline is what would happen in the absence of the carbon credit. It's your counterfactual, if you will, that you consider. Next principle is carbon accounting method. We want to make sure there are transparent and reproducible ways to do life cycle assessment. That means agreeing on what the system's boundaries are and properly accounting for the emissions within those systems boundaries, and doing it in a conservative manner. We also want to make sure that credits don't cause harm or that they pursue co-benefits and that they pursue environmental justice. Again, this is more qualitative in most cases, but there are important things around the monitoring and testing and verification of these practices to make sure that they're not causing or doing any harm. The last two we have, one is durability. Again, a really important issue for the industry right now. I prefer the term durability rather than permanence because I don't think anything is permanent, but we do want to store carbon out of the atmosphere for a climatically relevant time period. And one thing we've learned in climate science over the years is that fossil carbon is pretty much forever. The carbon that goes into the atmosphere is going to stay there for a very, very long time. So if you want to fully mitigate that with an offset, you need durability that's approaching thousands to tens of thousands or even longer in order to fully mitigate for that fossil CO2 emission. And then finally, we want to minimize leakage. Leakage is a complicated concept, mostly economically driven. I'll use an example of a forest. If you were managing a forest, you were harvesting it for saw timber and bioenergy, and you decide you want to enroll in an offset project and store more carbon in the standing trees on the landscape, that means you're reducing harvesting. What that ultimately means is there's still that demand for wood products in society, and so that activity that was occurring on that land might leak to other lands. And again, it gets very quickly down the holes of economic theory. Justin Baker's an expert in this, but leakage is definitely an issue that we want to understand when we're assessing high quality credits. So I'm just going to walk through a few verticals. I'm going to run out of time, but this will be fun. First, I want to start with forestry. There are really three ways that you can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. using forests. You could reforest, that means planting new trees. You could improve your forest management. It's called IFM, and that's what generates a lot of the credits these days in the carbon market. Or you could avoid deforestation. Avoided deforestation is not a removal, it's just an avoided emission. There are really three critiques that come up pretty often around forest carbon offsets. The first of them is around additionality. There's been some really great research came out in the past few years looking specifically at the structure of California's compliance forest offset program, which is used in its cap and trade system. And by comparing the lands that enrolled to the lands that didn't enroll, a group of economists and environmental scientists found evidence of adverse selection. That's a fancy word for basically the people who were least likely to have to change their practices were the ones that opted into this program. So the people that already had high carbon stocking, the people that already weren't logging are the people that are getting improved forest management offsets. And that creates a really important question around whether or not these credits are additional. The next issue that people talk about with forests is their durability. Obviously, if you're trying to store carbon in a forest for hundreds of years, thousands of years, you're dealing with a fundamentally insecure form of carbon storage and above ground carbon in carbon sequestration. And we have all kinds of biotic and abiotic factors that lead to reduction of carbon on the landscape. That can be a windstorm, that could be pests or disease, that could be wildfires as we're seeing in California. And again, kind of the forest carbon projects that are in California, many of them are actually burning up as the result of the state's worsening wildfire crisis, which of course undermines the credibility of the program. Leakage is something else that's really important here, and I already brought it up, but it has to do with displacing timber harvesting to outside of the project boundary. Okay, next up is soils. I'm going to rely a little bit on an analysis done by a group called Carbon Plan. They're also in California. They went through the 17 different protocols that existed for soil carbon sequestration on the voluntary market last year, and they rated them in terms of their rigor, their additionality, their durability, and their protections against safeguards. There are a lot of important things here. What is most important is that only 3 of these protocols require direct sampling as the basis for issuing soil carbon credits. That's a really important thing because it means that otherwise you either just rely on broad emissions factors or you use a model in order to estimate the amount of carbon that your soil carbon project is storing. Other issues have to do with the additionality mechanisms included here. Most of them rely on a very old additionality standard known as the Clean Development Mechanism. And really, Carbon Plan was not particularly happy with the state of soil carbon protocols. And I think really a lot of recent science has really backed this up. What they say and when they recommend to buyers is essentially threefold. The first one is you really need to define and screen individual projects. And that's what the buyers that we're working with in the voluntary carbon market are finding. They want to know their farmer, they want to know their project. They realize that the protocols themselves do not adequately control or screen for quality, and so they need a lot more extra information before they make their purchases. Obviously, they're asking for projects to adopt rigorous sampling requirements, which is actually even more recent science that shows that making sure that your sampling is statistically significant is actually a very hard bar to meet. If you care about things like statistics, and then finally, of course, because of uncertainty and durability risk, they even recommend potentially discounting these projects. I think these are fair recommendations. They're definitely conservative recommendations to the buyer. But it's because of what the state of the market that people are saying this. I'll move on and just talk quickly about some hybrid and engineered carbon removal approaches, and then I'll try to get off the stage in 2 minutes. Biochar is an exciting opportunity. It's growing very, very quickly in the voluntary carbon market, from essentially nothing maybe 3 years ago to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of tons exchanged on the voluntary carbon market last year. Biochar is used by is produced by heating biomass in a low oxygen environment. It's known as pyrolysis, and the solid resulting char looks just like charcoal, except you don't burn it. Can be used for a range of different things. It can be used in agronomy. It can be used to make different materials, things like anodes for batteries and things like that. It's used for water filtration. People are really excited about the opportunity. The reason why it's scaled so quickly is because we actually don't require monitoring, reporting, and verification of biochar after it is produced. We only test it before it's applied to the field. And based on, obviously I won't get to go through all this science, but the elemental ratios of carbon to oxygen and carbon to hydrogen, that's a metric for how recalcitrant or durable your biochar is. And on the basis of that, we've done life cycle assessment. We've credited soil carbon storage for 100 years from adding biochar. People talk about 1,000-year storage in biochar. People talk about 10,000-year storage in biochar. Probably not real, but it is what the market does today. And you don't have to go back out and sample your field after you apply the biochar. So that's really led to a pretty rapid scaling. Lots of large corporates are purchasing these things. Prices in the voluntary carbon market are really between $100 to $150 per ton of CO2 equivalent. It's a lot higher than soils and forestry offsets. It's an exciting opportunity, one that I see as kind of a midterm solution where we have more durability and we're a little bit more sure about the additionality, but obviously not approaching the gold standard of very, very long-term storage. I do think that these other engineered carbon removal approaches, things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, and enhanced weathering, can get to that gold standard of 10,000 plus year durability. They are commercially immature, but scientifically promising. And I'll stop with that. So thank you, guys.
All right, we do have 10 minutes for some question and answer. Ideally, at least one question for Dan and one question for Arlene from the audience. Do we have anyone? Here we go.
Yeah, for then, you stored about 12 million tons of agriculture carbon credits. Could you explain a little bit about how those credits were created?
Sure.
Maybe repeat the
That's a great
question.
question. Sure. So there have been, you said 12 million tons of carbon offsets issued in the agriculture sector, broadly stated. I actually don't know the breakdown of that, unfortunately. My guess is it would be a mixture of soil carbon crediting and then other on-farm practices, typically to reduce either N2O or methane emissions, something probably like anaerobic digesters for dairies in particular, where we're taking manure, things that were otherwise going to decompose, and turning them into CO2 rather than turning them into CH4. Thank you.
Yes, in the back. We'll repeat the question, so.
Okay, so my question is nutrient recycling with biochar. So you would also bury potassium, phosphorus, and other things in biochar, whereas if you sequester CO2, you wouldn't do so. Is that a concern?
Yeah, so I'm happy to I
Yeah,
can
go ahead,
summarize
repeat
the
the
question.
question,
So the question had to do with nutrient cycling, particularly when we are burying biomass. And the important distinction there is that biomass is not just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It's also a lot of other things. There's all biomass has some nitrogen in it. Green biomass has more nitrogen in it than brown biomass, just as an easy way to think about it. But there's also a lot of other inorganic components that are in biomass. And if we are burying them underground at the rate of a few billion tons of carbon per year, we start to get to levels of particularly phosphorus, it appears, where we might be starting to rival and put pressure on the manufacturing of phosphorus that we use right now. Nitrogen is pretty easy because we can pull it from the air with Haber-Bosch, but phosphorus seems to be the one that's really not renewable, and we could start to have some perturbations in the market if we did billion-ton carbon removal. I think the details really matter, though. As you said, BECCS probably doesn't put any of those trace nutrients below ground. Wood harvesting and storage likely does, but there are also ways to make sure that we're excluding the more nutrient-rich biomass in that. And biochar is kind of this mixed bag as well, because you're putting it back in the soil, which is probably a good thing. It might actually have trace benefits from ashes and things like that, but we absolutely need to be tracking it and considering it. Thanks.
Any other questions? Yes.
That's coming, and it really is based on, Oh, yeah, I didn't see North Carolina on the list. So, yeah, good eye. But really, the answer to that was really, as we launched, we took on the risk with the states that we had the work and we had the information and we had the models actually calibrated and approved for. So we're building those out to more crops and more states as you speak. Good question.
Anyone else? Still have a couple minutes. Yes.
I have a question about the additionality and the timeframes of relative climatic relevance. Do you think 10,000 years or even 1,000 is kind of selling ourselves short for, especially the ag community, on these more temporary storages that have been shown to have benefits? Maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, no problem. So the question that came up had to do with timeframes of durability, right? And I think there's a lot of hand wringing. There's a lot of disagreement. I like to think that we need to store carbon and carbon removal approaches that approach the timescale by which we're dealing with climate change. So, if it means that within 100 years we need to have the climate solution solved, then maybe something that approaches 100 years of storage is good enough. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a full neutralization of fossil CO2 emissions, but it does buy you enough time to that next energy transition 100 years from now that it still has climatic value. And I don't want to say that forests and soils can't approach that approach or that number. I think mineral associated organic matter in soils probably has durability along that time scale rather than the particulate organic matter, which seems to be a little bit less recalcitrant. And obviously, there are ways to preserve forests for hundreds or thousands of years. We just need to be really clear about what we're doing and make sure we're crediting these things appropriately.
I'm looking to Deborah. Okay, let's give Arlene and Dan one more round of applause. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the faculty briefs. So we'll have 5 faculty from NC State come up and talk about their exciting research. To kick things off, we have Alex Woodley from Soil Science. Alex, I did want to mention when you're done, take a seat at the panel. And then for the other faculty, when you're done speaking, just sit at the panel. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. Again, Alex Woodley, the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences. And today I want to kind of set the stage on agricultural soil sequestration. Agricultural soils have seen, historic depletions approaching, 135 billion tons of carbon over the lifetime when we convert from native to arable lands. And so that depletion is really the opportunity that everyone's excited about. We know where it was, we know where it is now, where can we build back up? And as we build that soil organic matter back up, we then are drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. And at a field-by-field level, it may seem like these are modest improvements, but there's such a tremendous amount of the land under arable agriculture that any small improvements on millions of acres can have meaningful change. I always like to show these these images by Nature Climate Solutions article by the Nature Conservancy. There they looked at binning, forest management, agricultural management, and water management in terms of carbon sequestration potential. And when you look at forest management, there's reforestation and a voted forest conversion are the 2 big things you need to go for if you want to have big change. When you look at agricultural management, there's no big circles, right? There's tiny, important slices of management that it's going to have, it's going to require a whole suite of activities to make change in agriculture. And some of the research that we look at are things like conservation tillage, cover crop, diversified crop rotation, and nitrogen management. But the key thing here is that the efficacy of any of these things like biochar, improved grazing, grazing intensity, avoided conversion, they're all context dependent. Things that work in the southeast are not going to work in the southwest. And so when we want to push these big national initiatives, we really need to think about them at a regional level, unfortunately. And there's no real single management practice that's the best. I would never be able to say, this is going to work, this is the key. It's going to be this multi-tiered approach. And when you think about these inherent potential and challenges that we have to work with, we can look at North Carolina as a great example. You can see here, this is a map of soil organic matter content across the state. And you can see that there's a huge variation at the state level. We can't even be prescriptive at a state or county level. We got along the coast a lot of heavy histosols, a lot of organic matter. The coastal plain in the center here, very low, and then kind of middle in the Piedmont Mountains. And that makes it really challenging to even approach guaranteeing any type of a state level carbon emissions. And the key here to actually start doing this, despite the challenges, is getting the baseline right. So when we talk about getting the baseline, we got to look at sampling strategy, even in the infield level. A lot of times we got to do bulk density, which is an extra amount of effort, but we can't really talk about stocks unless we talk about bulk density, and that's often not used. And then to what depth, which is the big question. There's the scientific community would like to go down 2 meters to be able to look at the full stock, but if you're out in the field with a T-probe, you can only down 30 centimeters. But the thing is that 30 centimeters, you can see a lot of accumulation at the top that might really mask what's going on across the whole profile. And so depth is a big one that we're trying to get a handle on. And then, as Dan mentioned, detecting change through intensive sampling is expensive. If you want to look at a power analysis on a really variable field, you might be taking so many samples that the carbon credit will be less than the cost of the sampling. And so that's a real kind of tension point between these model-driven carbon credit markets and the scientific kind of ensuring that we're seeing a difference. And it's challenging. We have some long-term studies in the coastal plain here in North Carolina that have very different practices where we have not really seen any improvement on carbon sequestration, despite things like land abandonment, no-till, organic. And that means that maybe other greenhouse gases are equally as important if carbon's not going to be the big story in these really hard-to-build places. So this is an example of some biochar work that we've done where we looked at, here we had controls. You can see no biochar, no compost added, biochar and compost. But the thing I want to show you is we had it with or without a cover crop. And this is the idea of additionality, not in the term of carbon credits, but these co-benefits you're seeing here. When just the cover crop was present, we saw a little bit of improvement, statistically noisy. You added biochar, you increase carbon, not exciting, not too surprising either. But then when you have that with a cover crop, you tend to see the cover crop benefits are higher. There's maybe this co-benefit of having the biochar or the compost there. But we're seeing that in the first 2 years. The question still come into play is, what's the life cycle analysis on that biochar? Was that economically useful to add that? And then also, we see these bumps from this cover crops that are really easily broken down. Will that persist for the next 5-10 years? So we see things, the end of the study might show a difference. If we come back from 5 years from now, will we see that difference? And so these are some of the questions we're looking into. And the other thing that we really drive home in the lab is that we look at a lot of the studies in carbon sequestration, but really we're looking at the co-benefits as well. We tend to have this carbon tunnel vision where it's, carbon and carbon. This is a great image I got off Twitter. But we focus on the carbon, but I think on agricultural fields, adoption, we got to talk about it in different aspects in terms of soil health, ecosystem services. There's a lot of other reasons to build soil organic matter in terms of productivity. And for example, here, we had this long-term study in the Reedsville area that we saw only carbon improvement at the 2.5 centimeter mark, so this high, but we saw massive differences in yields and in yield stability. And so the carbon story is maybe pretty modest, but the ability to produce food is tremendous based on just a slight ecosystem services improvements. And lastly, there's the interaction with the greenhouse gases, right? If we're going to add legumes to the system, if we're adding composts, if we increase nitrous oxide emissions, then we're really wiping out all these gains. And that's where a lot of my research lies, is looking at these trade-offs between emissions and carbon sequestration. And lastly, soil health is a really effective tool for communicating this. Improving soil health, you're generally improving soil carbon anyway. And so it really doesn't have to be a sticking point that it's carbon-based. You can talk about it in different aspects. But going forward, as much as we want to move into futuristic models, I think there's still the basics need to be there. We need to figure out minimum sampling size, detect differences, sampling strategy, and standardization across the industry would be really important to get any type of confidence going. And then more consistent understanding of carbon durability. And as Dan mentioned, mineral-associated carbon, POM, all these things, we really need to dial this in at a regional level as well, because a total carbon in the Midwest versus a total carbon here in North Carolina is very different. And there's other aspects as well. We have this huge push for remote sensing and also rapid soil sensors, and I think there's going to be a lot of potential there, but they need to be vetted against traditional sampling. And lastly, I think field research on the additive effects of these climate smart practices. When we layer these practices on, what's the co-benefit or trade-offs? And things like greenhouse gas emissions, they've been tricky to measure, they're a lot of work, but things are becoming a lot more accessible. The prices are coming down. We can do it on farm a little bit easier. And again, these models are only as good as the data being provided. So lastly, I think coordinated research across these regions. So asking one question really well, does biochar work on sandy soils, and do a huge breadth of studies. One really simple question is going to, again, breed a lot more confidence in this type of work. And so this is where, again, public and private partnerships are needed. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex. As a reminder, we have a Q&A session coming after the faculty are done speaking in about 15 minutes, so just hang on to your questions. Next up, we have Chris Osburn, who will be talking about coastal marine carbon dioxide removal.
Okay, thanks very much. It's great to be here. I'm a marine biogeochemist, so probably well outside of what most of y'all do, but that's okay. What am I going to talk about today? So you may have heard of marine carbon dioxide removal that's used in the ocean to remove CO2. And it's largely achieved in both biotic and abiotic ways, like we've already heard about. And you can see in this, this cartoon here what some of those types of processes are. But I'm a coastal ocean scientist. And what I tend to focus on is looking at the connected coastal domain. So not just the open ocean or even the coastal pelagic ocean out onto the shelf, but also thinking about our inland waters. So what about wetlands and estuaries and these types of things? And these are great sites because, like what happens in the ocean, like what happens on land, there's plant growth, there's CO2 drawdown as we make organic matter. And organic matter is kind of the key. That's the type of carbon I look at, but it's also part of the carbon cycle. It's removing CO2, so it's important. Our vegetated coastal ecosystems, or the so-called blue carbon habitats, are great sources for storing carbon. They grow rapidly, and they tend to pull a lot of the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so what we've been working on, and we've got this, this team we put together here, and the opportunities are to kind of look at different ecosystems for their capacities to store carbon. Now, the other point I want to make here is that it's not just organic carbon as organic carbon. We want to make that recalcitrant or that hard to degrade carbon. And I think that's where some of the opportunity in thinking about folks in this room and elsewhere where there's some research partnerships we can look at. Because if you make really labile carbon, as was pointed out before, it just rapidly gets recycled. So we want to try to figure out what mechanisms in primarily aquatic, but ecosystems on land, inland, in the coastal zone, and then well out into the ocean. How does carbon stable in those different environments? And I think there's a lot of opportunities there. We know a bit about this, but there's much more to learn. And part of this relates to also the ability of making this aromatic or again, difficult to break down carbon, and opportunities to see how that interacts with different carbon species, different metals, looking at how we can inactivate carbon degradation enzymes. A whole host of things that have been reported on already can be brought to bear, but looked at on large scales in some of our coastal aquatic and marine ecosystems. And so this really gets into looking also at MRV, because as a biogeochemist, that's kind of what I do. I go out and I monitor and I report and I verify. And I do this more not from looking at particular carbon capture processes per se, but how different coastal ecosystems function in that respect. And so that's what we're about. That's kind of what we do. And I wanted to bring that up and to set this as a stage, because then here's a cautionary tale I'm going to get into to conclude. Another thing I do is I look at the effect of extreme weather events on coastal carbon cycling. And it's a real worry for thinking about MRV, because we might know baselines from going out and looking at ecosystems and looking at primary productivity, looking at respiration and thinking about how fast carbon is stored, how fast it turns over. But what we don't know very well is what happens when we have tropical storms. And you can see that on the right here. Look at these little brown plumes. This is the Neuse River estuary. I'm sure some of you noticed this picture. You may have seen it in the news after Hurricane Florence in 2018. This was wrongly termed pollution so bad you can see it's from space. The brown's not pollution. That's carbon stored in wetlands, in pococysts, in forested swamps. That's carbon loss into the coastal zone and coastal ecosystems. And so my group's been working on this problem. We've looked at a number of these different storms. Inland rainfall is, we drive so much of the carbon that's stored in the landscape out into these coastal waters. That's what we're worried about. And then we finally, just to conclude here, we've looked at how reactive this is and what it means for the annual carbon budget. And so here's some data from Hurricane Matthew in 2016. On the left, I'm showing a table where we put together the annual carbon budget, and in the red dotted box here, you can see that the one storm, Hurricane Matthew, was about 25 to nearly 40% of the carbon export, this is lateral export, out of the system. So we're not even talking about CO2 capture. Now on the right, the table on the right tells you something about how these ecosystems respond with respect to CO2. This one storm released over 20,000 metric tons of CO2 just in the Neuse River estuary and Pamlico Sound. So I bring this up again as a cautionary tale and to kind of to say that we need to look for these very recalcitrant, hard to degrade forms of organic matter where we can store carbon for long periods of time. But our MRV have to take into account what some of these extreme events are doing in terms of how these surface ecosystems, both on land, in the coastal zone, and even out onto the shelf, are reacting with respect to carbon uptake and release. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So we've heard about carbon storage in soils in the agricultural landscape. We've heard about carbon storage in aquatic and oceanic systems. Next, we're going to move on to a bit more of an applied engineering presentation from Dr. Sonja Salmon, who's going to be talking about biocatalytic direct air capture. Sonja.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So this is my passion project, and I got to use notes, otherwise there's no way I can do this in 5 minutes. So just bear with me here. So first of all, these flags here are to spark your imagination. Textiles are durable, economical, high-performance materials that can tolerate being outside, and they could help fight climate change. So my name is Sonja Salmon. I'm an associate professor in the Wilson College of Textiles here at NC State, and my team is developing a technology that we call biocatalytic textiles. This can be applied for direct air capture. The goal of direct air capture is to permanently remove CO2 from the atmosphere. All right, everyone loves electricity, but still most of this is generated by burning carbon-based fuels. Combustion power produces billions of tons of CO2 every year, and alarmingly, the amounts are still increasing. So we need ways to remove carbon dioxide at atmospheric pressure, because that's how it's found in flue gas and in air. So reactive absorption, shown here on the left, is the most effective carbon capture method at atmospheric pressure. Components in a recirculating liquid chemically react with CO2 molecules in a gas mixture, and this selectively separates CO2 into the liquid. When the liquid is regenerated, CO2 is released, but now it's trapped in a pipe or captured. So these systems are already operating commercially for applications like natural gas cleanup. They require a lot of energy. Our goal is to help reduce the amount of energy by using textile-based wet filters with enzymes attached. So you already know that textiles are great at spreading liquids in a thin film. Think about your sweaty cotton t-shirt. Having this high gas-liquid contact area is very important for getting CO2 to react quickly. And we put an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase on the textile surface, which helps speed up the CO2 absorption rate even more. This lets us use benign, low-energy solvents that otherwise don't work because they don't react quickly enough. So this enzyme-textile combination has the potential to decrease absorber tower size, which would decrease capital costs, and decrease solvent regeneration energy, which would decrease operational costs. Our lab results show that the textile packing itself boosts CO2 absorption efficiency, and the modules work even better when the enzymes are present. So these modules, they work for both high and low CO2 concentrations, covering the range from flue gas to direct air capture. They work in the presence of or absence of oxygen. They also work with both high and low absorption solution concentrations, including alkaline-adjusted seawater. They're stable for long periods of continuous testing. They can be dried and stored and used again. They're lightweight and safe to handle, and they can function as drop-in modules for conventional reactor designs, or they can be adapted to other reactor designs, including linking them with CO2 utilization or storage. So once CO2 is absorbed into the liquid, there are several things you can do with it. By using conventional systems, the CO2 can be recovered in a pure form, like what's done at the Sleipner project in Norway. That long-running project is actually it's the longest-running project for CO2 storage, and basically it's shown that geologic sequestration works. Or you can take the dissolved bicarbonate directly from the absorber and pass it to mineralization with alkaline effluents that could be a waste stream in industry. Or the bicarbonate could be fed to algae or greenhouses to make biofuels and feed, or you can electrochemically reduce bicarbonate to platform chemicals like formate. So to help this move forward, we are looking for industrial collaborators who are interested in scale-up and field testing. It would be especially beneficial to have cost-share collaborators. This would allow us to pursue Department of Energy funding for next step scale-up. And that would be through like the National Technology Energy Lab or even through NREL. Both are interested in these types of technologies. So I thank you for being here, and if you'd like to know more, please let me know or visit our websites. We got a couple projects going. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sonja. So next we have Minliang Yang, who's going to be talking about mitigating carbon emissions through value-added bioproducts.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. Good to see you all today. I am a new faculty member in food bioprocessing and nutritional science. I joined NC State this January, so technically it's my second month here. And my research focused on applying techno-economic analysis and life cycle assessment in food and bioprocessing. So basically to explore different strategies to mitigate the life cycle carbon emissions and also to investigate the affordable bioproducts in bioprocessing. So today, I'm going to talk briefly about how to mitigate carbon emissions through value-added bioproducts. So first, if we want to know how these bioproducts work, we need to know where does bioprocessing happens. So from my past several years, I work on bioprocessing in cellulosic biorefineries. So basically, the whole process starts with biomass in the field. So we use agriculture and food waste and also bioenergy crops. And then after it got transported to biorefineries, within the biorefinery gate, we apply different biomass deconstruction and bioconversion pathway to produce biofuel and bioproducts. And in some cases, we will have excess electricity generated as that can be sold as an extra revenue to the grid. And as the main product from biorefinery, we know that cellulosic biofuel has a great potential to reduce GHG emissions relative to gasoline. And at the same time, in addition to produce biofuel, we can also produce bioproducts in this pathway. But what about their carbon mitigation potentials? So I'm going to walk you through some cases in biorefineries, how we do this work. So first is biogas upgrading. So typical biorefinery, we have biogas produced from wastewater treatment plant, and then it's sent directly to on-site heat and power generation to produce electricity. But we can do biogas upgrading to biomethane. For example, in this case, when we apply life cycle assessment, we actually found that if we co-producing biomethane from biogas and along with biofuel, the GHG emissions can be reduced from 93 grams carbon CO2 equivalent per megajoule to around 13 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And in addition to upgrading biogas to biomethane, we can upgrade biogas to other bioproducts, such as PHB and single-cell protein in this case. And what we found is that actually we can achieve like net negative GHG emissions by upgrading biogas to PHB and single-cell protein. And this is a newly published study in ESNT. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out. And in addition to biorefinery gate, for the biomass we used, one of the major components within cellulosic biomass is lignin. And lignin is a heterogeneous polymer which can be upgraded, which can be valorized to value-added bioproducts. And in this case, here shows for lignin-based ionic liquid. And in the figure, you can actually see that if we upgrade lignin to value-added bioproducts, the GHG emissions is actually much lower compared to what we have in the current market. And then, in addition to existing compound within biomass, what we can do is that using plant as a system to accumulate diverse value-added bioproducts, such as PHB, limonene, and artemisinin. And our previous work has shown that if we can co-produce, if we can incorporate in-plant accumulation of biomass along with biofuel production, we actually found this pathway can help to improve the economics of biorefineries. And then we compared this plant system versus microbial cell factory, and we found that when producing the same product, both plant and microbial system, they can do, they play an important role in improving the economics of biorefinery, but they have their own advantage and also shortcomings. So for our next step, I am to further apply life cycle assessment and to further explore to what degree the plant system, the plant-based products, and bioproducts from microbial cell factory, they can improve the life cycle of GHG emissions. And I'm open to any collaborations, both within academia and also in industry. So if you guys are interested in this plant-based bioproducts and also using microbial host to produce bioproducts, feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to chat more about it. Okay, that's me. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody. They saved the economics talk for the end, which I think is everybody's favorite, right? So just so we're all on the same page there. My name is Justin Baker. I direct the Resource Economics and Sustainability Lab in the Southern Forest Resource Assessment Consortium here at NC State. My lab specializes in the development and application of systems models, economic systems models that help us define interdependencies between resource systems that we care about where we can sequester carbon, like forests, like agriculture and food systems, like the energy system, and market demands for those resources. So why do we care about economic modeling? Well, if we think about a traditional techno-economic or engineering perspective on mitigation opportunities for a specific technology or a suite of technologies that helps us sequester more carbon, these studies often miss kind of a critical cost component that we like to refer to as market opportunity costs, right? So if we have a technology or a suite of technology that, for instance, restricts supply. You can see on the left-hand panel here. That puts upward pressure on prices, which induces a feedback loop and makes our mitigation source more expensive. Likewise, we can have technologies that increase, for instance, forest inventories, which could maybe put downward pressure on prices, which could have the opposite effect in a market system and induce some complementarity between markets and carbon sequestration goals. Why else do we care about economic models? Well, economic models help us think about resource competition across sectors. And within the context of an economic model, we don't have to treat mitigation opportunities as mutually exclusive, right? So this figure here was from a study we published last year where we were looking at multi-sector assessment of climate mitigation opportunities in the United States food, land, and forest system across 5 alternative socioeconomic baselines. The main punchline or takeaway here is whenever we look at agriculture and forestry together in a single policy incentive, we end up finding in the U.S. context that forestry, that is afforestation, reforestation, and forest management, plays a dominant role in our domestic mitigation portfolio. Why else do we care about models? We care about models because they help us think about the distribution of mitigation opportunities over time across regions. And in particular, if we think about the forestry system is falling into different zones, the temperate, the tropical, and the boreal zone, and mitigation coming from different bins, afforestation, reforestation, and extended rotation. We can identify or use models to help us project where we're likely to see the greatest opportunities over time from those bins across these regions. And that can be important in a policy context. Another thing that I really like this panel, the other thing that we can do with models is we can look at potential conflict or synergies between bio-based climate solutions and terrestrial carbon storage. So this is another study that we put out late last year where we developed a first of its kind global model intercomparison project of the forestry system. I'm not going to go through this really ugly figure on the left-hand side here, but I will point to the shaded figure up on the top left-hand corner. That is cumulative changes in carbon storage from the global forestry system over time under approximately 100 different scenarios that we ran. The key takeaway here is that in about 90+% of the scenarios that we ran across 3 different global models, we found that under the influence of strong demand drivers and strong climate policy incentives, we would see a net increase in carbon storage from forestry over time. So even though these are non-permanent solutions and some of the timescales we're thinking about, incrementally increasing carbon storage over time is a good thing. In the U.S. context, we've shown similar results. Again, going back to the study that we put out last year, we can start to identify similar levels of complementarity between demand-side policies that really stimulate markets for forest products and forest carbon storage, right? And so here we've got carbon in atmospheric terms now. So the greater the negative value, the more sequestration we're seeing. The orange blocks, or the orange shaded area here, represent demand-driven changes in forest carbon sequestration from U.S. forests over time. The blue shaded area represent kind of direct policy-driven, where we're paying for that carbon using offsetting approaches, insetting, regulatory approaches that pay directly for those carbon benefits. I'm going to skip this slide. Other things that we can do with these models, we can start to think about a wide range of trade-offs. On the left-hand side here, we've got a figure from a study that came out last year from some of my collaborators looking at global food security implications of climate mitigation strategies in the land sectors. And this study was interesting because not only did it show this kind of net negative impact on calorie production, but it also decomposed that effect into different mitigation sources: afforestation, bioenergy, and non-CO2 emissions reductions from agriculture. Some of my work recently with the STEP Center is focused more on understanding potential non-carbon sources of leakage. What are the potential water quality implications or the water consumption implications of increasing carbon sequestration? So if we have incentives in the southeast, for instance, to plant trees on agricultural lands and we're producing climate benefits, that could have a residual market impact that shifts the burden of that agricultural production to another region, drives up nutrient consumption, drives up water consumption. And so we're trying to take a pretty nuanced perspective on some of these other non-carbon effects. And I'll close here and say that in late 2021, we started a consortium, a collaboration between NC State, the University of Idaho, and the University of Maine called the Forest Carbon Quantification Consortium. This is a collection of economists and forest sector modelers that are really focused on research applications that directly look at these key issues related to forest carbon offsets. So we're doing a ton of work right now on leakage, an increasing amount of work on permanence risk, and additionality, and I would really love to engage with new industrial partners who are interested in these topics as well. And thank you all for your time. I know it went fast, sorry.
All right. Well, thank you, Justin. That was a lot about carbon. And so hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you have questions, because now we have 20 minutes for Q&A, a discussion. It can be informal. And then we're going to have these amazing grad students give their 2-minute pitches for 10 minutes. And then at 5, we'll go out for the social networking hour. Dan is moderating the panel.
Yes, and I hope Arlene joins me.
Okay, then I'm going to turn it over to you all.
Great.
Cheat if needed.
Excellent. We really want to encourage audience participation here. I'm just going to ask a first question while you guys think. Please raise your hand. We'll call on you right after this. I had a quick follow-up for Justin. What do you mean when you say there's a complementarity between bioenergy, wood products, and carbon sequestration? And, like the basic question I have is, doesn't harvesting more wood reduce the amount of carbon in forests?
So can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I'm going to skip the mic. We're recording, okay. Okay, are we on here? Okay, so that's a great question, Dan, and I'm glad to return to that. I'm not sure this is actually on here. Okay, so I think that there's this assumption in the climate policy community that if we're producing a forest carbon offset from a managed forest system, that we're giving up some equivalent level of potential removals that would go into some wood product stream. And I think that that's certainly true if you take a stand-level perspective, or if you're looking at kind of a single project. But when we're looking at a market scale, and we're looking at market incentives that kind of increase the value, the relative value of forest land as a whole, that drives investments that can be carbon beneficial. And so that's the feedback loop that we're capturing there, and the complementarity that we're seeing in a lot of our modeling recently.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin.
We'll take a look at the audience. Gentleman in the red? Yeah. Oh, even
So the question I have is really was looking at wetlands, and as we see sea level rise, is that going to increase the loss from wetlands of carbon?
So the question is for presumably for Christopher. Will sea level rise increase carbon loss rates from coastal ecosystems?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great question. There's some evidence of that. It's not something I specifically work on, but that's definitely a concern on not just as CO2, but also how that affects methane emissions.
We'll take the gentleman to the right of Ray.
I'd like to follow up on your question about the forestry here, though. When we think about that 100 years, which I liked your analysis, I'm assuming Star Trek after 100 years will come up with something better. So if we could mitigate for 100 years, I'd be happy. But if we build houses out of your wood, housing stock probably is on a scale of about 100 years. So, I mean, to what extent are we, harvesting wood is in fact sequestering wood because we're building something out of it that'll last for some length of time? How do we factor that in? But, I see the Amazon the opposite way. I don't see that as a mechanism, right? So, how do you balance those sort of the regionality of it in a way we think about the harvested product?
Great, and I'll just quickly summarize the question. The question for Justin had to do with really balancing the carbon in products and carbon in forests, especially considering the differences between temperate and tropical forest ecosystems.
It's a great question. I think in the U.S. context and some of our U.S.-centric studies, the potential for harvested wood products could play a sizable role in the overall mitigation portfolio. I'm using mitigation broadly to represent offsets or insets or whatever it is that we're talking about. I think globally, at least in a lot of the work that we've done, it plays a smaller relative role compared to, say, avoided emissions from deforestation and degradation, relative to, say, investments that improve the productivity of forest systems. We actually do see things that maybe aren't great from a biodiversity perspective when you have a strong carbon policy incentive, things like post-harvest transitioning away from naturally regenerated stands to faster growing plantations, which provide some carbon benefits but raise important ecosystem service concerns. So there's some trade-offs there, but certainly the wood product pool I think is an underappreciated component of all of this and could play a pretty big role here in the U.S. in particular.
Right. There was a lady here on the left. Yes.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Adrian. I'm with the First Flight Venture Center. My question for all of you is, we have a great entrepreneurial ecosystem here. How can we help you take your innovations to the next level?
How can we help you take your innovations to the next level?
That was for Sonja.
Yes.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Can I come talk with you? I think that would be the right way to go.
Any other
You should have asked for
comments from
money.
the panel? Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem. Right over here.
So I have a question for Dr. Salmon. For carbon capture, a lot of the times pressure is important, but temperature is important also. How do your biocatalysts and your textiles hold up in high temperature regeneration if you do require that sort of regeneration? And how does your product last with time?
Great. A question about the temperature sensitivity of Dr. Salmon's biocatalytic systems.
Okay, so there's a lot in that question. It all has to do with how you design the reactor and where you actually put the textiles and the enzymes. And the images that I showed, albeit we had to go pretty quickly through it, are on the absorber side. And the absorber side of that reaction is typically not higher than 50 degrees Celsius, which is very easily tolerated. That's the temperature of your washing machine, maybe. So the textile is going to be fine, and this particular category of enzyme is very tolerant of that temperature. On the regeneration side, you're right, the temperature might be an issue, but people are also working on building better enzymes for that purpose. Good question.
Great. Another question from the gentleman in red in the back.
Yeah, there's another one. If we look at international trade and we look at the economic situation, and you look at a place like Europe that's sort of reducing their food production and therefore going to have to import more from elsewhere, are economists or other people that are looking at carbon capture and looking at this area putting into effect, taking into account the fact that then food has to be transported to Europe or other places that's reducing their production? And how does that factor into this whole carbon market and how we're going to deal with these issues?
Great. So a question about
Also for agriculture.
excellent. Question about life cycle assessment and making sure we really understand the knock-on effects of using land for carbon removal. I'm not sure who's best for that. Maybe Minliang?
Yeah, sure. So from life cycle assessment point, when we do life cycle GHG emissions, we actually account for the land utilization factor and indirect land utilization. So this is one way we can incorporate the land transition from food and how we calculate the carbon emissions for the pathway. Maybe Justin can talk about from economics.
Sure. Maybe just from the trade perspective, really quickly, there are certainly modelers that are thinking about this. Market dependencies and how that affects mitigation outcomes at a regional scale, right? There's a big focus at NSF in particular right now in thinking kind of global to local when it comes to climate solutions or sustainability challenges. So it's definitely on everyone's radar, and there's no simple answer there.
So I'm selfishly going to jump in here. Plus, we haven't heard from him yet, Alex. And I haven't actually met him yet, but he's in my space around soil sequestration. What do we need to do and what improvements do we need with our MRVs to actually scale this cost effectively, and what the opportunities are for agriculture?
That's a big question. I think we're making strides on the monitoring, especially of the practices. We have remote sensing. We can see if people are adopting cover cropping, the time of planting, tillage is being enacted or not. I think where we still need to make improvement is we can't get away from testing, soil testing, but it has to be strategic. And so we can use remote sensing to try to get a feel for the variability of this site. Can we strategically sample to lower that need for this prohibitively expensive? And so I think remote sensing is a place, but we're still kind of inextricably tied to the testing, but I think we're making strides. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Back to the audience.
Great. I would encourage anyone else in the audience with a question. While you're thinking of it, I'll ask Christopher one more. Just maybe a silly question. What happens to coastal carbon once it's released to the ocean? Does it go to the bottom of the ocean? Does it stay in the top of the ocean? Does it go into the food chain? What's going on there?
Well, that you hit on almost everything that can happen to it, and that's one of the confounding points of this is how do we take and maybe manipulate some of those pathways and make that more efficient? So I showed that picture of all of the brown that was being lost from land into the ocean. Well, that brown, it looks brown because it absorbs light. And when it absorbs light, photochemical reactions can occur in the surface ocean that return that brown to CO2 and other gases. It can also break down those larger structures and make them more labile to ocean organisms. So I think that's one of the opportunities we have in thinking about those pathways as to how to maybe design different molecules and even facilitate storage in different forms that are more resistant to those degradation pathways.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Go ahead.
One of the questions that's going through my mind is in complementing a lot of the technical solutions that are being evaluated in research is who's doing the behavioral research, the behavioral analysis that is going to force us to change how we live our lives to address some of these issues, the food we eat.
Yeah.
Who's doing that?
Yeah.
What's necessary?
Sure. Open it to the panel first, especially if you guys have any colleagues at NC State. But who's doing social science research related to carbon removal and climate change mitigation?
I'm not, but can I comment?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So I don't do behavioral science, but I do have a comment. So I mentioned working on this was my passion project. Back when I started working on it in 2005, the total global emissions from anthropogenic CO2 emissions was 24 billion tons. Now it's 40 billion tons. Our behavior is not going to change. That's my observation. The population is growing. People want more stuff. Everybody wants a better standard of living. We really have to take this. Our behavior is not going to change. We love the potato chips, even though we know it makes us, yeah.
Great. Any other perspectives? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to further comment on that. So from food perspective, I'm really into the plant-based food. And one of the social related economics that people do is that people are investigating the consumers' willingness to pay, how much they're willing to pay for plant-based food versus the traditional meat. So this is one way how we can do this kind of analysis and to see how things change.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
Please, yeah.
I think some of the work I've done with social scientists is for adoption. The adoption piece is the perception of risk of taking on a new practice. Farmers are really risk adverse. They already have a high risk, like not a lot of control in their systems. And so asking them to do a new practice that may lower their yield or it's like the information's, wishy-washy on it, it's really difficult. So knowledge transfer extension is going to be really important for adoption. And so that perception needs to change.
Great. Other questions from the audience? Go ahead.
So one thing I didn't hear much about was the effect of soil microbial communities on either soil health or carbon sequestration. Do any of you do any of that research or know anybody who does?
Great question about soil microbial communities, probably to Alex.
So I'm not a soil microbiologist, but I work with a few of them, and the emerging field of biologicals and inoculants are really from an industry side very attractive because it's an input that they can sell. Showing that it sequesters carbon on a field level is really tricky. It's very noisy in the field, and so starting in the greenhouse, trying to get the mechanisms down, then taking it to the modeling or in the field is kind of this long-term step process that's kind of not always attractive for year-to-year industry partnerships, but that's where we're at now. There is some promise with certainly some growth promoters for root growth, but it's still hard to tie to large-scale sequestration. That's a golden ticket for that.
So I'm just going to jump in there and say that Bayer is investing in R&D in this area, and we've got a couple projects in this area. Additionally, that is one of the new rebate programs that we have to offer to all growers too, is with Sound Ag and their microbial products.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? If not, I know we still have a packed schedule. So how much more time do we have for Q&A? We have 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes, guys.
I'm going to jump in here and ask one question to Justin, who I also just met here this afternoon. Have you had the opportunity to look at the newly announced $3.1 billion grant that the USDA has given for climate smart practices in the U.S. and what the impact of that will be to our voluntary carbon market space? It's huge. The good news is
we're still recording, huh? Okay. So, it is huge. It's a massive investment. NC State submitted several proposals, as did most land-grant institutions. It's a very competitive process. Over 400, I think, proposals submitted. What I've heard is out of that 3.1 billion that they're looking at potentially 50 million metric tons of CO2 mitigation per year. So that's pretty costly on a per ton basis, but I think it could really kickstart some exciting research and some exciting programs. And what I like the most about it is the emphasis on public-private partnerships, linking together research with industry, which is very much what we're trying to accomplish here today as well.
yeah, and maybe we do need to take that offline, because I just heard from USDA representative here 2 weeks ago that how we're going to measure that and the metrics haven't really been sorted out yet. It's exciting, though. We did have a hand come up here that I cut in front of.
Oh, yeah, so I was wondering, for the textile product, the Biocatalyst, have you done any LCA to kind of link two concepts together on the overall benefit? It's obviously beneficial overall, but the cost of creating it from an emission standpoint, is it net out? Have you looked at that?
Just a question about the net life cycle impact of your carbon negative textiles or carbon removing textiles.
Yeah, so we haven't done a formal analysis yet. I'm eager to work with people who I may have recently met to be able to go into that. I had a similar question from a panelist in an online forum relatively recently, and somehow the discussion took me to make this observation, because I'm a textile scientist, and so I look at other things that are happening in the textile world. But we actually globally have about 50 million tons of textile waste simply being thrown away every year. So why don't we take those wonderful high-performance waste textile fibers and turn them into filters and help our carbon dioxide get out of the air? So I would have a very interesting interest in understanding the life cycle analysis when it comes to those materials.
Great. Well, I'll take the opportunity to ask the final closing question, since no one else has their hand up. This question is for Minliang. You mentioned that you can create things like single-cell proteins and other kinds of proteins, and you mentioned that they're net negative. They remove carbon from the air. I'm wondering, is that actually storage of carbon, or is that displacing other kinds of protein when you say that? When you say that it's a net negative impact?
Yes, it is replacing for other. And actually, when we do PHB upgrading to single-cell protein and PHB, we are incorporating not only wastewater from biorefinery, we're also incorporating like manure and also other organic waste. So it's a multi-input biorefinery concept, so that we upgrading this biogas to PHB and single-cell.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Well, a round of applause for our NC State faculty presenters, and thank you guys for the active Q&A. Turn it back over to Debbie.
This is the part where I get to have fun. So, not that the rest of it wasn't fun, just saying. My name is Deborah Thompson. My role for the College of Ag and Life Sciences is Research Partnership Development. It is my pleasure and privilege to put together events like this one where we connect our amazing faculty with industry scientists, always with a goal of developing research collaborations. As Mark Schmidt mentioned earlier, I work hand in hand with the partnership developers at the university level. I also work hand in hand with the advancement team. Dinah Schuster was here somewhere. Dinah, are you still here? No, she ran out on me. What can I say? So one of the things that we've done recently, because we keep hearing from our industry partners how important it is for us, not that we didn't already know it, but for us as a university to be developing the next generation of workforce and, oh, by the way, connecting that workforce with you guys in industry. And one of the ways that we're doing that, no pressure, guys, because these are 5 representatives now of some of the workforce that we are developing. One of the ways we do that is through what we call 2-minute pitches. I call it 2-minute pitches, let's be honest. It's an opportunity for a student or postdoc to get in front of you to talk for 2 minutes and 2 minutes only. I will cut you off, just like that, and to present a research project that they're working on. It'll be rapid fire. There will be no opportunity for questions in the room, but we have a networking opportunity immediately after, and so we will end theoretically on a bang, and please do make a point to talk to the students after. And with that, we will begin with, hang on, I have to set the timer. We will begin with, there she is, Barbara Machado Marquez, speaking on CRISPR genome editing, building a path for climate resilience in forest trees. Barbara.
Hello, everyone. My name is Barbara, and I would like to start this talk with a question. How do you imagine forests will look like in the future? Maybe 100 years, 200 years from now. Well, a very realistic scenario due to the climate changes is the complete devastation of forests, which are caused by harsh environmental conditions and increasing spread of pest-related diseases. So to overcome this scenario, we need tools to rapid improve to quickly improve genetically the forest trees, and which currently can take decades, right? So our group over the last few years has been working to develop the next generation of forest trees, taking advantage of novel genome editing technologies, such as CRISPR-Cas9. So we have developed transgenic-free CRISPR genome editing tools for, I'm sorry. I'll have to look at the paper. We have been demonstrated transgene-free CRISPR genome editing as a tool for production of superior lines of economically importance, such as pines and eucalyptus trees. We are currently optimizing the production of regenerants from CRISPR-edited lines, a process that has been proven to be very challenging, and we are optimizing it for the application of a large-scale application of this technology. The establishment of transgene-free CRISPR approaches will allow the fast production of sustainable wood, bioproducts, and biomass, as well as climate-resilient forest tree lines. We believe that with CRISPR, we can build up, we can design the next generation of forest trees. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. Our next presenter is Dan Willard. The title of Dan's presentation is Life in Hot Acid, Leveraging Thermoacidophilic Sulfur Oxidation to Power Biological Carbon Dioxide Upcycling.
Thank you, Deborah. Sorry for the mouthful in the title there. Hi, everyone. I'm over here from the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering Department, and I realize I'm talking to a room full of plant and ag scientists, so when I say CO2 fixation is energetically expensive, you probably think photosynthesis. The Kelly Hypothermophile Lab focuses on a different kind of CO2 fixing organism, thermoacidophiles. These archaea live in hot acid environments like the Yellowstone hot springs and derive their energy for CO2 fixation from inorganic substrates like oxidizing elemental sulfur, iron, and pyritic ores, which are all currently waste products of the petroleum and mining industries. We propose to design a thermoacidophilic platform that powers CO2 upcycling using these energy-rich inorganic waste streams, generating C3 plus chemicals as the primary product. The process of energy generation from these inorganic substrates also produces valuable secondary products like sulfuric acid and soluble metals such as copper and nickel. An initial techno-economic analysis of projects that an 8 bioreactor system of about 3,300 meters cubed per reactor would generate approximately 90.9 million in annual revenue and upcycle roughly 200,000 tons of CO2 to acetone annually, acetone being an example product here. But this potential can only be achieved with an effectively designed genetically modified organism. Our approach uses comparative multi-omics to guide metabolic engineering of our target organism with validation and optimization of the platform through metabolic modeling of lab-scale bioreactors. Our ultimate objective is to deliver this practical and flexible thermoacidophilic platform, which can be used in a patentable industrial process for synthesis of organic compounds from CO2 powered by sulfur and pyritic waste streams. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Ethan Woods. Ethan's presentation is composting coupled with gaseous CO2 capture. Go ahead, Ethan.
So, over the last year, we've heard a lot of encouraging news about this industry. A lot of money pouring in, finally some policy support, and obviously a wide range of brilliant solutions being developed at universities like this. So what is the problem? That up there in the middle of the screen is the problem. And you might be wondering, what is that? That is a carbon dioxide molecule taking up 0.042% of that screen. That is equivalent to the concentration in the atmosphere. So what is the solution? One of the solutions is identifying highly concentrated streams of carbon dioxide that are already being emitted. And we believe that we have found one in the form of composting. So composting is the breakdown of biomass-based materials into nutrient-rich soil amendments. But what you may not know about composting is that between 30 and 70% of the carbon that goes into a composting pile is emitted as carbon dioxide. So through our work, we are allowing plants to act as direct air capture units. And then as those plants break down at the end of their life, we are manipulating conditions in the form of reactor design, composting, recipes, and different variables in terms of the reaction in creating highly concentrated streams of carbon dioxide that can be captured at low energy and capital intensities. So we are seeking partners in the form of investment or biomass waste feedstock sources for us to break down and create these highly concentrated streams of carbon dioxide. Thank you.
So you heard him, Andrea, wherever you are. Our next presenter is Kyle Vogt-Lowell, speaking on comedifying flue gas molten salt-assisted olefin synthesis.
Said the last name right, which is pretty impressive. So to reach our goal of net zero emissions by 2050, decarbonizing the industrial sector is essential. The cement, iron, and steel and chemical industries alone account for 20% of CO2 emissions globally. But unfortunately, a large portion of these emissions are difficult to reduce. That's because these emissions stem from the process itself or come from fossil fuel combustion that's needed to reach their high energy demands. And from the latter case, one of the most notorious processes in terms of carbon footprint is steam cracking of ethane into ethylene. Now, ethylene is an important precursor for a lot of our plastics and synthetic fibers and other commercial goods. So ethylene demand is here to stay. So how do we make this process greener and more sustainable as we look for better alternatives? Our research proposes to do so via molten salt mediated chemical looping, which we call MMODH. In this process, in a simplified diagram shown, ethane and flue gas are injected into in separate sides of a partly partitioned semi-batch reactor where they interact with a molten salt medium made of alkali carbonates to capture CO2. So ethane cracks in this high temperature melt to form ethylene and hydrogen. That hydrogen then interacts with the carbonates, anions in solution to form hydroxides and carbon monoxide. On the flue gas side, the CO2 from flue regenerates this carbonate so that the process can continue. Now, preliminary Aspen modeling, an experiment has shown that this process could save or reduce the cost of ethylene production by as much as $135 per ton, while capturing greater than 80% of CO2 emissions. And with carbon monoxide being a flexible reactant for many industrial processes, long-term carbon sequestration can be realized here by turning it into high permanence products like bioplastics, concrete, and carbon nanotubes. Thank you so much.
Our final 2-minute pitch presenter is Michaela Robson, speaking on enhancing the sustainability of microbially induced carbonate precipitation.
All right. So microbially induced carbonate precipitation, or MICP, is a technology that uses microbial processes to generate bio-based building materials, or biocement, and promote the sequestration of CO2. This is very important because traditional cement production methods produce about 8 to 10% of carbon dioxide emissions globally. And so it's also important to note that these bio-based bricks are equivalent in their functionality of durability and strength to conventional bricks as well. So the most common used mechanism for MICP is urea hydrolysis, and this is performed by the enzymes urease and carbonic anhydrase that will break down a molecule of urea into an ammonia and a carbonate that will get precipitated. So the carbonic anhydrase can also aid in capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and turning it into carbonate. The issue here is scalability due to the production of ammonia, which can become toxic in the large concentrations. So in order to create a sustainable system for upscaling the MICP, we need to develop an effective method to remove the ammonia. And so we propose using a heterotrophic nitrifying, aerobic denitrifying, HNAD bacteria to remove the ammonia. And they do this through a series of reactions that ultimately results in the production of dinitrogen gas that leaves the system. And so some of these HNAD bacterial species have also been identified as carbonic anhydrase bacteria because they contain highly efficient carbonic anhydrases that can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Estimated calculations show that around 18% CO2 mass can be sequestered per material volume over a year with this process. And so we are a consortia of a ureolytic bacteria with an HNAD bacteria can create a sustainable system for large-scale MICP applications and long-term carbon sequestration. So we are currently working to optimize this in the lab and get it working well and working on preparing to submit a disclosure for invention. Thank you.
So you see why I enjoy working with the students. So let's give all of our student presenters another hand. A couple of thoughts in closing. Mark Schmidt mentioned early on, and in fact all of our presenters mentioned, that it's important for us to pull together all of the bright minds from across the university, especially when we've got these big hairy problems, as Steve likes to describe them. And what you heard from today was faculty presenters from 3 different colleges. Our students were from 3 different colleges. Since one of those colleges wasn't the same, we actually heard from 4 different colleges. You do the math. So I think we did a nice job of really showing that NC State is taking a multidisciplinary approach to these big, hairy problems. Thank you again to all of our faculty presenters. Thank you again to Arlene and Dan for not only your presentations, but also moderating the panel. As you leave, first, please join us for the networking portion. As you leave, I don't know where it sits on the carbon sequestration spectrum, but leave your name badges with us, okay? We will reuse them, and I'm sure it fits somewhere on that carbon. What else? I think that's about it. Thanks, Joe. You were amazing. Good job. Go forth and drink a glass of wine for me.